Hi, Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec here. I wanted to talk a little bit about a news story that kind of crossed the wires here this week about Java officially dropping support for serialization. Now, the folks over at Oracle, who of course own Java now, are on the record saying, quote, that serialization was a horrible mistake. I think this is in result largely to the rash of serialization, or more importantly, deserialization vulnerabilities that have occurred or at least been publicized over the last, we'll say, roughly 24 months. Now, serialization vulnerabilities are nothing new. If you're not familiar with serialization, effectively what's happening here is that we have a Java object that's being turned into a string. Some other languages call this freeze and thaw operations. Java calls it serialization and deserialization. Right? So effectively, what we have here is we have an object that is being placed into, or basically converted into, a string. That could be stored in a database, for instance, for later use, so that we don't have to reinstantiate the object. Of course, this is super useful from that perspective, right? Super important from that perspective because, again, a lot of folks use this for an application standpoint, application development standpoint. And of course, anytime I hear that somebody's dropping support or that we have a major language like Java, again, making some serious changes, in this case to the JVM, again, how the Java virtual machine is going to run, this concerns me a little bit. Right? Now, we've had a couple of clients call up and say, okay, look, if Java's taken this seriously, should we drop serialization support from our applications? As part of the SDLC, should we just not serialize objects? The answer to that is no. There's nothing inherently insecure about serialization. The problem comes in when people serialize and, more importantly, deserialize improperly. Now, what do I mean by that, deserializing improperly? Well, if we serialize an object, and let's say, for instance, we place that object in string form into a cookie, and that cookie then is passed back to the user in an unencrypted form. This is the kind of thing that we find on pen tests occasionally. We found it on some pretty high-profile websites, believe it or not, and high-profile web applications, maybe I should say. And in this particular case, with a cookie that's been passed to the user, of course, controls that data. Now, this is no different than any other data that you pass to the user. We have an insecure use of the code. The difference here is, and this is where things really kick in, normally you send something down on the cookie, maybe it's like an authentication value. Potentially, the user has the ability to impersonate somebody else, maybe the session ID or user ID or something along those lines. So we have the possibility for impersonation, maybe cross-site scripting, and maybe SQL injection. In these cases, we're not looking at something that is going to result in a full compromise of the server. Not so with serialization. Right? With serialization, basically we pass the string down to the user. The user turns around then, and the user, attacker, whatever, turns around then and modifies this string, which is then sent back to the web server, where indeed it is deserialized. Now, of course, an object can contain both code, methods, as well as data, which are normally referred to as attributes. And what the user will do, or what the attacker will do, is they will replace usually what we call the getter method. Right? So they'll override the get method of the object itself. Normally these objects, actually, they're serialized. In most cases that we've seen in our pen test at Rendition, what we normally see is that the object itself is really just being used as a data structure. And what ends up happening here, of course, is that when this object is brought back, the getter is called from the base class. Now what we're doing in this case, or what we will be doing in this case, is we're going to overload and basically replace the get function, right, or the string read function, effectively, of the object. The idea here is then when this object gets passed back to the server, it's deserialized, and now when the server goes to read data out of the object that never had methods in many cases in the first place, we've now overridden the get method. When they then try to read data from the object, they're executing our code. So as opposed to a SQL injection vulnerability, it's purely a data disclosure. As opposed to a basically passing insecure session handling, or passing a session ID value back down, that's not at all what we're seeing here. Right? So again, possibility for in some other web vulnerability classes, user impersonation, possibly redirecting and infecting users in the case of cross-site scripting, or stealing session IDs for later replay. And then, of course, in SQL injection, we have the ability to begin dumping data from the web server. I like to think about serialization on the same level as command injection. Right, so command injection vulnerabilities, as we all know, are very, very serious because you're running arbitrary code, or have the ability to run arbitrary code on the web server in the context of the web application. One of the things we have to do then, of course, is find a place where we can write and still call from and all that. Not so at all when it comes to serialization. We get full remote code execution, and in getting full remote code execution, we actually pass the specific code that we want to execute. It's game on, right? So is serialization bad, or deserialization vulnerabilities, are they bad? Oh yeah, baby, they're absolutely bad, right? Worse than SQL injection in most cases. And look, realistically, again, forget about SQL injection when it comes to serialization. Again, we can then directly query from the database, right? So definitely not a winning spot to be if you're a developer. But this comes back to the whole question of, is serialization bad? Well, my kind of thought on this is no, 100% not. If indeed serialization is bad, I would argue that SQL is also bad because, of course, we have SQL injection vulnerabilities. And, of course, both of those arguments are ridiculous. Now, I understand in the case of Java that we have a lot of programmers improperly implementing serialization. Is the right move for that to actually rip the support for that serialization functionality out of Java? I think the answer to that is an overwhelming no. But separate from that, let's step back, because I know there are folks in the security community that are going to argue with me and say, well, look, if developers can't figure out how to use the tool, serialization, appropriately, we just need to get rid of it. I can listen to this argument. However, I have to step back and ask, realistically, do you truly believe that everybody who has come to rely on serialization in Java up to this point is going to suddenly drop support for serialization? They're going to refactor all their applications. I think the answer to that is no. Now, for the ones that are going to refactor, I think that they really have two choices. They can completely get rid of serialization as a paradigm, or they can move to a third-party library. And you can just about bet that there are going to be a number of third-party libraries. I mean, there already are a couple of third-party classes for serialization. They're going to either move to one of those, or I'm sure others are going to sprout up as a result, probably a couple that play heavily into the commercial space. So in this case, you're refactoring some of your code, but you're not actually changing fundamentally the way the application works. That's a best-case scenario. I'm going to be straight up and say I don't think that's what the majority of the internet's going to do. I think the majority of folks that have used serialization in their applications are simply then not going to rev the application. They're not going to rev the Java version on the application, and they're going to be running on old, insecure Java. So while I understand what Oracle's trying to do, I also recognize how bad this is going to be for the industry. Now, as a pen tester, I have to tell you, I like what my future looks like. As an incident responder, I have to tell you that I see bad things coming. Right? So as we talk about serialization support and should we be dumping serialization, again, if you're looking to refactor web applications, again, I wouldn't get rid of the serialization support necessarily. I would just ensure, of course, that you're programming following good secure programming paradigms, making sure that you aren't passing any untrusted data back to the user. Again, it's not serialization that's causing the problems, it's the use of the serialization. Right? Now, granted, we have seen a whole rash of application vulnerabilities, and of course, with these application vulnerabilities, we know, of course, that these were pretty high. Several of these have been very high profile. Again, I understand what Oracle's doing. I understand that they're trying to make it look like they're taking a tough stance on this problem and saying, hey, we're going to correct this. We've got security taken care of. Rock on. Look, totally understand that. I got to tell you, my prediction is I think this is going to result in worse security rather than better. Right? So what I would say is, highly recommend, by the way, if you have a Java development shop and you haven't had a code review, you haven't had SDLC, you haven't had a web application pen test. Certainly there are a number of providers out there that you can talk to. Of course, we'd appreciate it if you call Rendition. But look, very seriously, this is something that you should be thinking about, right? Again, if you haven't done this, if you haven't reviewed your code, specifically the serialization code, to make sure that it's secure. And by the way, I have to tell you, just because you've had a cut rate pen test in the past does not mean they've tested for this, right? Again, we find this regularly years into the application being vulnerable. This particularly comes in a lot of these custom web portals that people put together. Again, we find this regularly where it's been missed by a lot of other pen testers. Again, I know there are a lot of competent folks out there. Unfortunately, there's a lot of incompetent folks as well. Again, would highly recommend that you talk to somebody at least to audit your code. Again, that's one of my big takeaways here is that Oracle is so serious about this feature being such a problem. And again, bear in mind, the feature itself is not insecure. It's that so many people are screwing up the use of the feature that they actually are going in and announcing that they're going to remove the feature in a future version of Java. That has to tell you what percentage of the population is implementing this insecurely. So again, my big takeaways. 1, you may not need to refactor your apps necessarily. from moving away from serialization, but you do need to start looking at implementing a non-core Java library. Second piece is definitely don't run on an old JVM if and when Oracle actually does follow through on their promise to dump serialization support. And finally, coming full circle, again, I highly recommend, particularly if you use serialization, and if you don't know, feel free to give us a call, or anybody for that matter that's a competent penetration tester. Feel free to give somebody a call. Certainly, again, we'd appreciate it if it was us. But bottom line, you want to make sure that you've looked for serialization level vulnerabilities or serialization related vulnerabilities in your Java web applications. And I have to tell you again, this is not a problem that's unique to Java. Lots of other languages support this. Practically everything that you see running the web today in dynamic fashion supports some freeze, thaw, serialization, deserialization operation. They are every bit as vulnerable if the serialized object, or the frozen object in some cases, or in other cases they refer to this as pickling. Right? So again, the pickled object, again, if that's treated in an insecure manner, where it's passed back to the user, where the user has any control over modifying this at all, you're absolutely as vulnerable as Java. And I think we can all agree you never want to be in the class where you're absolutely as vulnerable as Java. Anyway, thanks for your time. Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec, signing off.